William Gibson's Neuromancer is one of the best and most influential science fiction novels of the 20th century. This was the book that ushered in the cyberpunk movement, impacting not just science fiction literature, but also movies, television, comic books, and video games. As famous and respected as Neuromancer is, it's never been successfully adapted into a film, in spite of many, many efforts. From psychedelic guru Timothy Leary, to cult sci-fi director Vincenzo Natali, to the guy behind those freaky Aphex Twin music videos, this story, like the book itself, involves some very surprising and unlikely characters. This is the production history of William Gibson's Neuromancer. Neuromancer may not have been the first cyberpunk story, but it's probably the most important. Along with Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, it's one of the genre's two main creative wellsprings. Originally published in 1984 as a humble $3 paperback, the book's arrival was not highly anticipated nor widely covered. William Gibson was an obscure first-time novelist, part of an emerging underground movement of sci-fi authors working to infuse the genre with a new punk rock sensibility. The style they pioneered, cyberpunk, would find its first popular literary breakthrough with Neuromancer. A visionary and stylistic tour de force, the novel told the moody and noir-infused story of a burnt-out hacker named Case, hired by shady figures to plan a dangerous heist involving super-advanced AI constructs. Written with paranoid urgency and melancholic depth, the plot made for an arresting thriller, but much more impactful was the book's powerfully evocative setting. Gibson imagined a gritty and grimy world transformed by technology. Data was the ultimate currency, the method of trade a vast computer-linked network called the Matrix. Neuromancer was grappling with concepts years ahead of its time. Some of its ideas may come off as more charming than revelatory for today's readers, but that's only because we now arguably inhabit the world it predicted. Gibson was basically envisioning the modern version of the internet long before it actually existed. He even coined a term for it: cyberspace. Neuromancer galvanized the science fiction community and swept every major sci-fi literary award of that year: the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Philip K. Dick Award. Its world and tone were so prescient and so fully realized, it essentially laid the template for nearly every cyberpunk work that followed. It's impossible to imagine movies like Ghost in the Shell and The Matrix, or video games like Deus Ex and Perfect Dark, without Neuromancer. Even the more offbeat cyberpunk creations like Gattaca and Code 46 explore core thematic concepts that owe at least part of their inspiration to Gibson's novel. But most of these creative offspring would not begin to appear until well after Neuromancer's publication. Cyberpunk was slow to find its way into the popular mainstream. A bit like Lovecraft, whom I covered in my previous series, Gibson was an innovative and original voice whose style just didn't seem to easily translate. The early history of Neuromancer's stalled journey to the screen has got to be one of the strangest I've ever encountered. The information is a little fragmentary, but here's everything I could piece together. In the late 80s, William Gibson was fast becoming something of a rock star in his field. Neuromancer was followed by Count Zero and Mona Lisa Overdrive, both set in the same universe but focusing on different characters, and the trilogy's kinetic and highly visual style began to attract the attention of Hollywood. Gibson started receiving screenwriting offers, leading to the author's secondary career as a frustrated screenwriter. He worked on several unproduced scripts, perhaps most famously a now widely admired early draft of Alien 3, quite a bit different from the version eventually filmed by David Fincher in 1992. The Neuromancer film went into development as early as 1986, but instead of the conventional studio development deal, Gibson sold the rights to a small production team called Cabana Boy Entertainment. The story of this company's brief lifespan is a rather fascinating odyssey. According to a 2016 blog entry on the Digital Antiquarian, Cabana Boy Entertainment started when two actual Cabana Boys, apparently former employees of the Beverly Hills Hotel, decided to make a sequel to their favorite movie of all time, 80s cult classic The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. Neither of them had any filmmaking experience, but they managed to bankroll the enterprise enterprise by teaming with the wife of a wealthy plastic surgeon. Although they were able to convince Buckaroo Banzai screenwriter Earl Mac Rauch to commit, they weren't able to raise much interest in the sequel. The team switched focus to Gibson's Neuromancer for reasons that aren't entirely clear, and somehow talked the author into selling them the screen rights. Rauch remained in place as their screenwriter, Gibson agreed to lend the team his support, and unbelievably, countercultural icon Timothy Leary joined as a creative consultant. This whole improbable venture resulted in a 1986 promotional video pitching the film to potential investors, which surfaced online a few years back. And just as improbably, it led to what is sometimes described as one of the best PC games of the era. Timothy Leary was actually an early proponent for video games. Part of his commitment to the production involved putting together the film's video game adaptation, originally planned for simultaneous release with the movie. Leary's initial vision for the Neuromancer game was said to be quite ambitious. Devo was going to create the musical score, William S. Burroughs was involved as a writer, and David Byrne and Grace Jones were set to appear as in-game characters. Eventually, these plans had to be scaled back. Leary managed to get a more modest version of the game published by Interplay in 1988. It's not particularly well remembered today, but occasionally it does turn up on lists of the greatest games of all time. The movie, unfortunately, would not be so lucky. Cabana Boy Entertainment apparently became somewhat notorious around Hollywood, due to their lack of experience, alleged delusions of grandeur, and a developing behind-the-scenes drama. Around 1987, the company finally began to implode. The original founders departed, the wife of the plastic surgeon was left in charge, and she continued trying to sell the film on her own. She wound up doing a pretty good job. A screenplay was apparently copyrighted in 1988, then, against all odds, a contract was signed with TriStar Pictures in 1989. But that's as far as the production ever got. Cabana Boy Entertainment was dissolved in 1993, and the rights to the book reverted back to Gibson. Neuromancer's subsequent movie deals would not turn out to be quite so fascinating or colorful, but the project still had an unusual journey ahead of it. Throughout the 80s and 90s, cyberpunk motifs began to surface in mainstream movies. Cyborgs became popular action heroes. Computer technology and artificial intelligence began fueling action plots both big and small. Few of these movies matched Gibson's level of skill and daring. Although the author's work drew continued interest from high-profile directors, including James Cameron, Catherine Bigelow, and Michael Mann, no project ever seemed to advance beyond the early planning stages. Neuromancer's status was even fuzzier. It's a little unclear exactly when Gibson regained control of the book, because the author is rumored to have produced his own Neuromancer screenplay around 1990, 3 years before Cabana Boy Entertainment officially dissolved. I wasn't able to confirm the existence of this script, but there is another screenplay, dated 1990, that does appear to have turned up online. This one credited to Chuck Russell, director of the surprisingly good 1988 remake of The Blob. Not much is really known about Russell's involvement, making it difficult to determine whether he produced his screenplay for the abandoned Cabana Boy production or someone else. An old Gibson fan site, William Gibson Aleph, claims only that Russell wrote a script, did some pre-production, and that's it. Sometime around 1994, when Neuromancer's rights were definitely back in his possession, Gibson appears to have sold them to another company, this time a professional one. Interestingly, it wasn't one of the major Hollywood outfits. It was a Canadian company called Alliance Films. Alliance appears to have been mainly a distributor, specializing in local Canadian productions. They put out a notable roster of sci-fi TV shows, including Reboot and Tech War, and put out a number of respected films by Canadian auteurs, including David Cronenberg's Crash and Adam McGoyan's The Sweet Hereafter. Again, the details are hazy. Alliance is rumored to have begun planning a Neuromancer film around 1995. While this is difficult to confirm, it does seem to indicate that the project was being eyed as a possible follow-up to another Gibson adaptation, Johnny Mnemonic. Based on a 1981 short story set within the Neuromancer universe, Mnemonic was about a human hard drive who couriered valuable data using cybernetic implants in his brain. It was the first filmed adaptation of Gibson's work, and one of the earliest commercial attempts to introduce hard cyberpunk to mass audiences. Recently, the genre had started making some real headway into mainstream culture. Freejack took place in a dystopian future populated by technological mercenaries. The Lawnmower Man offered a groundbreaking visualization of cyberspace. Hackers paid tribute to Gibson's influence on the emerging cyberculture. None of these movies really connected with audiences at the time, nor were they particularly great films, but they indicated how Gibson's ideas were starting to catch on. Meanwhile, the cult following for Ridley Scott's Blade Runner had grown so strong it led to the 1992 video release of the director's cut, one of the first times an alternate version of a studio movie was ever given second life on home media. Shortly afterward, two of the genre's best films hit theaters: Catherine Bigelow's visceral thriller Strange Days and Mamoru Oshii's philosophical action anime Ghost in the Shell. Again, neither was financially successful, but both earned some good notices from critics, and like Blade Runner, found loyal followings on video. Johnny Mnemonic, on the other hand, was considered a total disaster. The feature debut of successful New York artist and music video director Robert Longo, Mnemonic had gradually ballooned from a tiny art house film into a $26 million studio project starring Keanu Reeves. Undoubtedly one of the weirdest studio sci-fi movies of the 90s, the story's perverse humor and extreme idiosyncrasy failed to mesh with studio pressures to deliver a marketable action movie. Only very recently has the film started earning appreciation for its bizarre tone and impressive visuals. For a long time, it was dismissed as something of an embarrassment, nearly damaging Gibson's movie career beyond recovery. The Neuromancer project, assuming it was real, never went any further. Robert Longo was said to be attached as the film's director, but even this appears to be little more than hearsay. Cyberpunk was starting to look as if it would never become palatable to a wider audience. The next Gibson adaptation to appear was a low-budget, semi-avant-garde production. New Rose Hotel, directed by indie provocateur Abel Ferrara, only received limited distribution in 1998, and was poorly reviewed by most critics. But it actually captures the stylish attitude and grimy atmosphere of Gibson's writing extremely well. The story was about a woman hired by a pair of thieves to seduce a prized corporate employee so that they can sell his skills to a competitor. Ferrara's low-key adaptation avoided action scenes and heavy effects work, allowing the author's themes of trust, betrayal, and self-destruction to come to the foreground. Of the few movies directly based on Gibson's stories, this is arguably the best. It showed how the author's work could be successfully translated on a smaller, less visually elaborate scale. It's too bad that no other filmmakers followed its example. Gibson sustained his screenwriting career penning episodes of The X-Files, and cyberpunk finally had its big commercial breakthrough in 1999, with the Wachowski sisters' action blockbuster, The Matrix. Suddenly, interest in Gibson's stories rekindled. Neuromancer went back into production, and Chris Cunningham, a British visual artist with a background in special effects, was announced as the film's director in 1999. A reclusive, enigmatic figure, Cunningham rose to fame in the 90s with stunningly grotesque and almost inexplicably freakish music videos for Aphex Twin and other electronic artists. He contributed special effects to movies like Judge Dredd and, coincidentally, Alien 3, and spent a year working with Stanley Kubrick on what eventually became AI, artificial intelligence. Said to be extremely averse to typical Hollywood filmmaking practices, Cunningham spent around 2 years writing Neuromancer's screenplay, working in almost total secrecy. Gibson, after meeting with the director, gave his full approval to Cunningham's vision, calling him the only person who had a chance in hell of doing the film right. Various screenplays for Cunningham's Neuromancer have turned up online, some with Gibson's name on them, but all are reportedly fabrications. Once again, very little is really known about the film. The screenplay was likely never even completed. Cunningham appears to have struggled with the adaptation, and most sources claim he was never able to devise an approach to the material with which he was fully satisfied. By 2004, Gibson confirmed that the film had been cancelled. To date, Cunningham has been unable to complete or release a single feature film. Only a handful of experimental videos and personal art projects not intended for wide release have surfaced over the years. Some, like the demented and deeply unsettling Rubber Johnny, have become widely traded internet curiosities. Gibson continued publishing novels as the movie deals deals and screenwriting offers ground to a halt. For the first time in his career, he entered the mainstream bestseller lists in 2003 with Pattern Recognition, a more minimal and contemporary set departure from his earlier cyberpunk work. The book featured a minor character allegedly inspired by the author's meetings with Cunningham. Gibson's film career never really got off the ground, but Neuromancer kept attracting renewed interest. Within just a few years, the next round of development deals would commence. In the mid-2000s, Neuromancer appears to have passed into the hands of a smaller, independent company called 7 Arts, run by producer Peter Hoffman. Once more, the timeline is not easy to sort out. Hoffman's name sometimes appears in connection with the earlier Alliance Films production, and it's rumored that his company was also behind the Cunningham version. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to confirm any of this. Still, other reports date 7 Arts' involvement sometime between 2006 and 2008. However it happened, Neuromancer was apparently being set up at Hoffman's company as a large, independent production, budgeted around $60 or $70 million. Another music video director, Joseph Kahn, who had made his feature debut with the 2004 biker action movie Torque, was hired around 2006 or 2007. Storyboard artist Dan Fraga posted artwork from the production to his blog in 2011, showing off early plans for a few of the film's action scenes. Hayden Christensen was rumored to be playing the lead around 2008. 2 years later, the movie was abruptly scrapped and production started over. Vincenzo Natali was announced as Neuromancer's new director in 2010. A former storyboard artist, who apparently contributed uncredited work on Johnny Mnemonic, Natali started making his own films in 1997. His first feature, Cube, was a micro-budget sci-fi horror film cleverly designed to make the most of its minuscule resources. Essentially set in a single, endlessly repeating room, Natali used careful camera angles, lighting changes, and sound design to convincingly suggest his characters were trapped in an infinite and hellish labyrinth. Natali's subsequent films were built around equally inventive concepts. He continued working low budget until 2009, when he directed the sci-fi thriller Splice. Although a financial disappointment, the film's creepy and persuasive effects, bringing to life the genetically engineered central character, caught the attention of most reviewers. Natali started putting together several larger projects. In addition to Neuromancer, there were adaptations of J.G. Ballard's High Rise and Stephen King's It, a remake of Swamp Thing, and an entry in the Predator franchise. Natali posted artwork and script pages from these abandoned productions to his Twitter page in 2015. Of these, Neuromancer seems to have spent the longest in development. The film officially entered pre-production in 2011 as a Canadian-European co-production. Natali wrote a screenplay which apparently met with Gibson's approval, and a large portfolio of striking concept art was assembled. The director in interviews expressed a desire to avoid making something too conventional. The structure and style of the original novel allowed for something more adventurous, and Natali was keen to take advantage of this in his adaptation. In 2012, Lorenzo di Bonaventura joined as a producer, and parts were offered to Mark Wahlberg and Liam Neeson. Natali's Neuromancer might have come closer to actually happening than any other version of the film. Sadly, the money just never seemed to materialize. No further progress could be made, and about 2 years later, de Bonaventura left the film. Shortly afterward, in 2015, it was confirmed that Natali had dropped out as well. The property traded hands, and the search for funding continued without a director. It was reported that C2M Media, a Chinese company, was going to finance the film, but no further updates were heard until 2017, when the production suddenly turned up at Fox, with Deadpool director Tim Miller attached. That production, too, soon went quiet. Interest in Gibson's work seemed to be drying up. There hadn't been any new adaptations of his story since New Rose Hotel. Neuromancer had been all but eclipsed by the popular franchises it had inspired, and the author's most recent fiction was leaving cyberpunk behind to explore other styles. In 2022, the pattern of misfortune was finally broken. The Peripheral, an Amazon streaming series based on Gibson's 2014 novel, was the first major adaptation of his work in almost 25 years. Set in a bleak near future, the story follows a young woman drawn into a complex conspiracy after discovering that a mysterious virtual reality game is actually a link to an even more bleak, distant future. It wasn't cyberpunk, but the book marked something of a return to Gibson's particular style of high-concept sci-fi. The adaptation is high on intrigue and a little excessively action-driven. It doesn't quite preserve the author's startling imagery or his dry humor. However, it makes a real effort to engage with his ideas in ways that modern viewers might be more likely to connect with. Appropriately enough, Vincenzo Natali was an executive producer and director on the show. The Peripheral isn't a great adaptation, but it certainly helped introduce Gibson's work to a wider and younger audience, and its success appears to have opened up a new course for Neuromancer. In late 2022, Apple TV Plus announced plans to adapt the book as their own streaming series. Miles Teller is supposedly the frontrunner for the lead role, and the show is set to begin production this summer. Now that we've reached the end, I'm sorry to say this is another one of those projects where the story of its lifespan doesn't leave us with a real conclusion. At least not yet. It's still too early to say anything about the Apple TV series, and the way things have gone in the past, it could easily wind up being yet another version we never end up seeing. Right now, the timing looks good. The Peripheral has been renewed for a second season, Gibson's books are attracting fresh interest, and cyberpunk is enjoying a lot of prominence in popular culture thanks to successful games like Cyberpunk 2077. So we might have a good chance of seeing Neuromancer brought to life on screen within the next few years. If not, it probably won't be the last we hear of it. Neuromancer is too good and too important a book to ever go away.